Sleep paralysis is a terrifying phenomenon where a person becomes conscious but is unable to move, often accompanied by frightening hallucinations. While it's a well-documented experience, the following 3 stories highlight just how disturbing it can be when combined with nightmarish visions. 1. The shadow man Lisa had been dealing with sleep paralysis sporadically throughout her life, but one incident shook her to her core. It was a warm summer night when she woke up frozen in her bed. At first, she recognized the sensation. Her body was completely immobile, though she was fully aware of her surroundings. But this time was different. She heard a faint shuffling sound near the foot of her bed. Unable to move or cry out, Lisa's eyes darted toward the corner of the room, where a tall, dark figure loomed. The figure was featureless, just a silhouette darker than the night itself, but it was undeniably watching her. Slowly, it began to move closer. The weight of dread pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadow man moved with deliberate slowness, creeping to the side of her bed until he was standing right next to her. She could feel his presence, cold, oppressive, and malevolent. Then he bent down. His face, or where his face should have been, was inches from hers. Lisa could hear a faint, rasping breath as though he was breathing directly into her ear. Unable to scream or escape, she was forced to lie there, paralyzed and helpless. Suddenly, the figure leaned in further and whispered something unintelligible into her ear. The sound felt like static, but she couldn't understand a word of it. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure straightened and walked backward, melting into the shadows at the edge of the room. When Lisa regained control of her body, she shot up in bed, drenched in sweat. She had experienced sleep paralysis before, but the sensation of being watched by that shadow figure haunted her for weeks afterward. Every night she dreaded going to sleep, afraid the figure might return. The old hag Darren had never experienced sleep paralysis until one night in his mid-20s, when he woke up to the horrifying sensation of being unable to move. At first he felt the familiar weight of sleep pressing down on his limbs, but soon he realized something was terribly wrong. The room around him was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through his blinds. His eyes scanned the room, his body frozen in place when he suddenly felt the bed dip beside him, as though someone had just sat down. A cold rush of fear swept over him and his heart began to race. Then he saw her. An old woman, hunched and grotesque, was sitting at the edge of his bed. Her hair was matted, her skin pale and wrinkled. She was grinning, her mouth filled with jagged, rotting teeth. Slowly, she turned her head toward Darren, her eyes milky white and devoid of life. She began to crawl toward him, her skeletal fingers digging into the mattress as she moved. Darren tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, as if something were strangling him. The old woman crept closer and closer until she was right on top of him, her face inches from his. She let out a low, rasping chuckle, her breath smelling of decay, and then she pressed her bony hands down on his chest, pinning him further into the bed. Darren's chest felt like it was being crushed, and he struggled to breathe. The old woman's grin widened, and her eyes seemed to glow with sadistic glee. He could feel her weight pressing down on him, as though she was trying to suffocate him. Just as he felt like he couldn't hold on any longer, she vanished. In an instant, the pressure lifted and Darren could move again. Gasping for breath, he sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around the room, but the old hag was gone. Yet the memory of her face, her eyes, and the weight on his chest stayed with him long after. 3. The suffocating presence. Jess had read about sleep paralysis but never thought she'd experience it herself. One night, after staying up late studying for exams, she finally collapsed into bed. Not long after, she woke up feeling like something was wrong. She couldn't move. Her entire body felt glued to the mattress, her muscles unresponsive. Her eyes were wide open and she could see her darkened bedroom clearly. The door was closed and everything seemed normal, except for the intense feeling of dread that washed over her. Then she heard it, a low, guttural breathing coming from the corner of her room. It sounded like something huge, something dangerous was standing just out of sight. Jess tried to turn her head, but her body wouldn't obey. The breathing grew louder, closer. She could feel its presence now, something heavy and malicious in the room with her. Suddenly, she felt an invisible weight press down on her chest as if someone or something was sitting on her. It was crushing, suffocating. Her breaths became shallow, panic rising as she struggled for air. And then she saw it. A dark, indistinct figure began to take shape at the foot of her bed. It had no features, no face, just a black void where a person should be. The figure moved slowly, crawling onto the bed, its weight increasing the pressure on her chest. Jess could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence growing heavier and more oppressive as it crawled closer. It leaned over her, its face, or lack of one, hovering inches above hers. Jess felt her heart pounding in her ears, her vision starting to blur from lack of oxygen. The pressure was unbearable, and she thought she was going to suffocate. Just as the crushing sensation became too much to bear, she gasped and woke up fully. The figure, the pressure, everything was gone in an instant. She sat up, panting, her heart racing. Though she was free, the suffocating feeling and the memory of that faceless figure haunted her every time she tried to sleep after that night. For weeks, Jess dreaded going to bed, terrified that the presence would return. Sleep paralysis became a recurring nightmare for her, and each time the suffocating darkness felt more real.